Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are back with my LCK 2025 offseason overview, grades, analysis, review, whatever you want to call it. There are plenty of words that I think could accurately describe how we go over things in this video, but we're back with some LCK content on the offseason going into 2025. If you haven't checked out the video we did for the LEC, it's the same exact video as this one, except for the LEC teams. Check that out. It's up on the iCard right now. I appreciate all the support on that video, but today we're going to be going over all 10 of the LCK off seasons, talking about whether or not I think teams are moving in the right or the wrong direction, whether or not I like the decisions they're making. Spoiler alert, I really do. I think this is the best off season the LCK has maybe ever had, at least in terms of like completeness, like the top and the bottom teams actually doing some really interesting things. I think, I've been very critical of LCK off seasons in particular in the past because it just feels like the bottom four-ish teams aren't really trying all that hard to actually win at the LCK level. It feels like obviously the money gap is pretty large between the top teams and the bottom teams, but this was the first off season where it really felt like almost all 10 teams were moving in the right direction and were making moves that I think could theoretically get them into top 6 conversations, which I really like. It doesn't feel like it's going to be quite as bad as it was in 2024 in terms of the difference between the good teams and the bad teams. Obviously, we'll talk about that more as we go throughout the video, but a couple of ground rules that I want to set at the start. First and foremost, this is not a primer or a power rankings video. I'm not going to be rating or ranking these teams in terms of how I think that they will perform in 2025. That's going to be later on in the offseason, basically right before the actual season starts in winter, because I still need a bit of time to like fully get tape reviewed on a lot of the LCK Challengers League players that I just didn't see as much of as the actual LCK players, and obviously I need to formulate my rankings and all of that stuff. This video is specifically going to be about whether or not I think their offseason was good or bad, whether or not I think these orgs are moving in the right or the wrong direction, and alongside that, that means that this isn't going to be a player ranking video. I'm not going to be ranking these players in terms of their positions. Again, that will be later on in the offseason. This is going to be a grading scale, and as you can see up on the screen now, here is the key. Here is the grading scale. I'll go over it, but one thing that I want to make abundantly clear before we get started is that these grades are unbelievably flexible. I got so much flack specifically on the LCK version of this video last year because I just don't think people understood how my grading scale worked. And so, sorry if you don't want to strap in for like a 5 to 6 minute explanation on grades, but I'm going to do that here because clearly there was some sort of miscommunication last year that I would really like to avoid in the comment section this year. What I mean when I say that the grades are flexible is that there really isn't a huge difference between 1 or 2 grade spots above or below. The amount of times last year that people were like, "You're so disrespectful giving a player an A- when they should be an A," or "I can't believe you'd give a player a B+, he's clearly a B." Like, it was actually staggering how many people were willing to die on that hill as if this was some sort of massive revelation. Yeah, I think within the span of 3 games, a player could go from an A- to an A, or within the span of 7 games they could go from a B+ to a B if they're really not playing all that well. Like it's really not all that big of a difference between these tiers, and I'll kind of talk about that, but all of these are super contextual. If you are pausing the video and scrolling around and just looking at the grades, you're not going to get the actual value of this video. Basically, all of the interesting bits are going to be what I say. The graphics are there to help facilitate my opinion and to give more of a quantitative, like actual analyzable grade on it, but at the end of the day, it's really just going to be about whether or not I think the player is good for the team. Now, like I said earlier, this is not a power rankings video, and that means that players are not just solely ranked based on how good I think they will be in 2025. This is a value-based video, whether or not teams are getting good value with a lot of these players. There might be players with really high upside, or what I perceive to be really high upside, that have higher grades than players that I think they will perform worse than this year, and that's just generally how videos like this go. Typically, I would talk about like imports, getting taxed a bit in terms of losing value because they are taking an import slot, but because it's the LCK, there are no imports, and so we don't have to worry about that here. But with that PSA out of the way, let's go ahead and get into what the actual grades themselves mean, because they are very similar. There are very minute differences between some of these grades in terms of the ones that are close to each other, and I think it's good to kind of expand on generally what I mean when I put one of those grades on the screen. If you're in the A's at all, A+, A-, you're one of the 5 to 10 best players in the world, period. End of story. I don't think I really have to explain on that too much. I'm very hesitant to give out A+ and A grades. These are players players that have been the best player in their role for, 3 or 4 years in a row at this point. Even if you've been really good over the past couple of years, if you've shown any flaws, like literally any at all, I'm going to be hesitant to give you anything higher than an A-, and that's including players that have been the best in their role for a little while. And so, it's a very, very harsh grading scale at the top, but that's supposed to represent the difference between the best players in the world and the players that are exceptionally good, elite even, and MVP caliber players at this level, but maybe I don't think that they're quite as valuable, in my opinion, as the players at the top. It's really supposed to separate the top 1 or 2 or 3 players. I don't exactly remember how many, A or above players we have, but specifically A+, this is going to be your best of region. If I give a player in the LCK an A+, that means that basically no matter who their teammates are, they are going to be favorites to win the LCK. That's just kind of how it goes. These players have proven over and over and over again that at the very least domestically, they're able to perform highly. That's another point I really want to make. People are going to get real mad with some of the grades in this video because guess what? This is not a Worlds ranking. This is not me projecting what they're going to be at the World Championships. This is me projecting what they're going to be in the LCK. When we get to the Worlds content later on in the year, I will do that, obviously, but, there are going to be some players that maybe have some international disappointments that are really highly graded in this video, and players that do well internationally but haven't been as consistent domestically that are going to be lower than maybe you would expect in this video, and that generally is just representative of how I think they're going to perform domestically because that's what I'm grading here. It's an LCK video. I'm grading it for the LCK. So again, I hope that makes sense, but as I was saying before, A+ means you're probably the best player in the world, or at least the most valuable player in the world, and any team would want to have you and would likely be able to build a Worlds winning team around you regardless of what else was there. If you're an A, that means you're a player that is basically as valuable as an A+ player. You are a #1 asset on the best team in the world, but I don't think that you've quite proven the consistency nearly as much as A+ is. We'll talk about the specifics of those when we get to them. A- is still elite. There were so many people again last year that criticized me for putting players in A- when they thought they should have been A's or A+ in terms of value. A- still indicates that this is a player that is likely top 1 or 2 in their role in the world and likely top 5 in the LCK. I'm certainly not trying to put down anybody in A-. It just means that maybe you're not going to find the same level of consistency that you would with an A+ or an A, where I would be stunned if they had any split where they weren't in the top 3 to 5 in MVP voting. A- might theoretically have a split where they're just okay, or they might have stretches of time like 2 or 3 weeks where they're just fine, but for the most part are going to be gigantic assets and likely will be some of the best players, especially mechanically, in their role in the world. If you're in the A's at all in the LCK, you're a top 5 to 10 player in the world. End of story. And so hopefully that helps at least a little bit. I'm sure I'll still get a lot of comments. But as we get into the B's, this is where it starts to get a little bit more specialized. There's really no difference between B+ and B in terms of upside. B+ just means that you have been more consistently good as a starter, where a B just means that you've been as good as B+ is, but you've been it a lot more inconsistently. And that's really the only difference that I want to point out there. Of course, B+ are going to have a little bit more favor from me, but there are going to be a lot of times where a player that is a B graded player will outplay a player who's a B+ graded player just because they're hot at the certain time. But you have to, kind of take the ups and the downs with B players more than you do with B+, or at least that's the idea of the grading scale. Again, not really a difference in upside from those two grades. Once you start getting into B-, these are still good starters that I think you would be happy to have, especially if you're like a lower, tier team in the LCK. If you're not one of the top, 3 or 4 teams, a B- is totally fine to have. You can make Worlds with a B- in your starting lineup, but they're likely going to be like the weakest starter on a Worlds team, or a mediocre starter on a mid-table team. That kind of idea, where you might be looking to upgrade from them if you really want to take that next big leap, but they're players that have more than proven that they deserve to be in the LCK, and I'm certainly not frustrated by them having a spot over some other player. But as we start to get into the C's, this is where it starts to get a little bit more questionable for me. Luckily, we actually don't have a ton of C players in the LCK because, again, I just think the offseason was awesome from basically everyone involved, but C+ is still going to be somebody that I think is good starting. Like, you feel okay about them starting, but they're likely starting for a bad team in the league, and they have to prove it to me. This is a player that has to earn their spot next year, in my opinion, even if they have earned at least a shot this year. But once you start getting into C or C-, these are players that are very borderline in terms of starting. C is like, you've proven to be, very inconsistent at this level. You've been given chances and you've not necessarily made the most of them. And while it's okay that you're starting, while I'm not like incredibly upset that you're one of the starting players in the league, you got to prove that you deserve to be that for more than like a couple of weeks. Like if you start out slow, I'm going to be kind of calling for, replacements. These are players that have a ton to prove. And then if you hit C- or anything below that, I have deemed you not worthy of a starting spot, whether that's because your tape at lower leagues is just, shockingly bad and I didn't expect you to get called up, or alternatively, you've played at the LCK level and you've been so bad that I'm stunned that you got another opportunity. I believe the only player I gave this to last year was Taiyun for KDF, and so, that kind of thing, where it's like you've played and been horrible and, you need more seasoning. Like, it's kind of crazy that you got another shot, that kind of thing. But overall, this is mostly a grading scale just to indicate how confident I am that you are going to be an above average player or you are going to bring value to your team. Now, this grading scale does change when we are talking about players who were not playing at a top level last year, players who were playing in the Challengers League or, somewhere else like overseas, in the LCS or something like that. Those players are getting graded on a scale of B to C. I just can't give somebody who's not played in the LCK higher than a B because you just don't know. We've seen so many super hyped up prospects come into the LCK and really struggle. Players that have really succeeded elsewhere have come into the LCK and just not been the same kind of player. It's a hard environment to adapt to, especially early on. And that does mean there is a little bit of an inherent cap on what they can be in year one, but the B to C scale is a little bit different for that specific reason. I don't have it listed on the screen, but if you're a B and you've never played in the LCK, I truly believe that you are like a game-breaking type of prospect. I think you could come in and immediately make a difference in the same way that we've seen with players like Pays in the past, just being able to come in to a top team and immediately like become one of the best players in the world. Like these are elite level prospects that could easily become B+ or A- players like in year one. A B- is still a good prospect, somebody that I think deserved their call up and deserved to be given a chance at the LCK level. I would have been a bit frustrated if they didn't get that, but I'm not like 100% sure going to be world beaters in year one. Once you start getting into C+ or C+, I still feel okay about the call up. Maybe it wasn't like guaranteed that this player would get called up and be an LCK player the next year, but certainly I'm not like frustrated by it, and I think it's a good punt. And if I give a prospect a C, it means they've got a lot to prove to me. It means that they likely have not shown on tape, at least to me, that they deserve to be an LCK prospect, but, I'm going to give some time and grace because I've been wrong about that in the past. It's really hard to analyze players on bad LCK Challengers League teams. It's just a very weird environment to try to analyze, individual performances on because of the way the league is structured, and so these are players that I haven't seen it on in tape, but I'm not necessarily going to give up on anybody who's yet to play in the LCK. But again, I'm not going to give anybody who hasn't played in the LCK above a B because it's just hard to do so, you know what I mean? It's hard to say that anybody playing at this level is immediately going to jump in and be a B+ or an A- caliber player. B is still a very high grade in the grand scheme of things. So 12-minute intro. I know you guys get a little upset when these go long, but I kind of have to for these videos. These are really the only videos that I have to have these ridiculously long intros for because people are going to misconstrue my thoughts, regardless, but hopefully this helps in terms of the comment section. So without further ado, let's actually get into the content of the video 13 minutes in. The first team that we're going to be going over is going to be the team that got first place from last year in the summer split. We're going to be going in that order, so first, second, third from summer. No real like power rankings in this video, as I said, so I figured this was the easiest way to do that. And the team that of course got first, maybe a bit surprisingly, last split and last year was of course Hanwha Life Esports. And now we can talk about what you see on your screen in terms of the format for the rest of this video. Of course, you can see a lot of things on your screen. In the top right corner, you're going to see how they finished in the summer split. On the top of your screen, you're going to see their 2024 roster. Bottom of the screen will be their projected 2025 roster. I say projected because I don't think all of these are technically confirmed, but I think like 99% of these are technically confirmed. But I'm going to be going over the changes, the decisions that they made, whether or not they brought certain players back, whether or not they changed certain players out, and those are going to be represented with that thing in the middle. Either it's going to be one of four things. I guess it could be no change, and that means that the player is the exact same as it was last year, that they're not making a change in that role. It could be change, which is definitely the most contextual. That means that they are making a change, and I can't specifically classify it as an upgrade or a downgrade because I think that there are pros and cons, and again, that's the most contextual knowledgeable of all of the ones, that's the one you kind of have to watch the video for. I think that there are a lot of changes that require some nuanced discussion that could either be, players being relatively similar levels and swapping teams, or alternatively, it could be young players coming in and maybe you're getting worse in year one to potentially, gain some upside that could theoretically be better by the end of year one, that kind of thing. We'll talk about those individually when we get to them. And then of course, upgrade and downgrade are pretty self-explanatory. That means that I think you're either getting better or worse, like strictly at that position. And again, we'll talk about all of those in depth because there are some nuanced discussions about those as well. But let's get into Hanwha Life Esports. They were the surprise LCK winners from the summer split last year. Nobody really gave them a chance to beat Gen.G, and yet they walked out of the finals with the trophy, which was awesome for this team, and they're not rocking the boat. In fact, I think a lot of people would say they just got better this offseason. Obviously my grading scale would indicate that they got better this offseason, going from a B+ to an A- in the top lane, but we're going to go ahead and talk about why I don't think it's quite as cut and dry as that, at least for the LCK. Again, people are going to get real mad about this discussion. We're starting off strong, so let's get into it. Their lineup for 2025 is looking like Zeus in the top lane, Peanut in the jungle, Zeka in the mid lane, Viper at AD carry, and Delight at support. Nobody on this team below an A-. I truly do believe that. I think this is one of the more well-rounded teams in the world, and I think they would have performed even better at the World Championships had they not been drawn Billy Gaming in the quarterfinals. I think that was a miserable draw for what is likely, in my opinion, like the third or the fourth best team in the world last year, pretty clearly, depending on how highly you want to rank Gen.G, with their international performance. But HLE was really good, and I do think that there is a strong argument that they got better. We'll quickly talk about the players they're keeping. It was a no-brainer to keep as many players from last year as you possibly could. I think there are a lot of good candidates for the best player on this team. I'm going to give it to Peanut in terms of value. A lot of people are going to want to give it to Viper. We'll talk about him in a second. I think Peanut is still underrated. I don't know how much longer we have to deal with this, but this guy just continues to perform like one of the best junglers in the world every single year, again and again and again and again, and yet people are like, is he really the best jungler in the world? Because he only plays Maokai and Sejuani, and all he does is get, 500, gold leads in the early game and then completely take over the mid game and not allow the enemy jungle to play. Is that even all that impressive? It just feels like a really weird argument to be having. Peanut once again was an MVP frontrunner last year for a lot of the year, ended up getting a little bit outpaced by some of the Gen.G, players, with how good that team was just overall, but it's Peanut. I mean, he came over to HLE and performed just as well as he was playing on Gen.G with Chovy for all those years. He is one of the best junglers in the world, and he has more than earned this A grade. Viper and Delight are both going to get A- grades. Viper was an A for me going into last year. I just don't know if he's like that much better than all the other AD carries. It's not that he's not really good, and that it's not that he's not in the conversation for being the best ADC in the world. It's that I'm not sold that he's guaranteed the best ADC in the world like I kind of was going into last year. I still think his year last year was super comparable to his 2023, which you're not really going to hear in terms of a lot of other people's opinions, but this A- grade is not meant to be disrespectful to Viper. It just means that there are going to be some games where he's a little bit more of a background player on this team because Peanut and Zeka are definitely more of the focal point. Delight had a great year, though. He really solidified his spot as one of the best supports in the world, played around the same level as Viper. I was concerned about whether or not he would continue to succeed outside of the Gen.G system. Those concerns were completely alleviated last year. He was unbelievable. And of course, if you followed this channel at all, you know my feelings on Zeka. One of my first big takes on this channel was how good Zeka was and how undervalued and underappreciated he was by the community. And then he went and won Worlds. And so, I feel pretty good. He's continued to stay at that high level. People still talk as if he's only good in the playoffs or only good at international tournaments or when games matter. He's awesome in the regular season. I don't really know what games other people are watching. This guy is amazing. He's just a really good mid laner, one of the top 3 to 5 in the world, and any team would be lucky to have him. They're very happy to bring him back. I do think that he's a little bit more on the borderline of like A-, B+ in comparison to Peanut, Viper, and Delight, who I think are all firmly in the A's, but that's only because you're going to have a couple of games every year that he's just a little bit more aggressive than he should be, and overall, he's going to be a massive value to this team and one of the best mid laners in the world. But the one change is in the top lane, and it's going to be Zeus coming in for Doran. I already know there are probably 4 or 5 people that have posted comments saying that I'm super disrespecting Zeus by putting him A-. He is the player that I had the entire intro for because I already got a billion comments on that last year when I gave Zeus an A-, but I'm sorry, like, his regular season was horrible. Like, there really is no other way to say it. This guy was, like, actually bad for a majority of the year and then started playing well when it mattered, and that's great. I'm really happy for him. An A- I still think is a really, really good grade, but I just can't give him an A when he genuinely wasn't even a top 3 top laner in the LCK for most of last year in terms of the performances he was giving. It really just was worse than people think it was. Go watch those games and go back and watch the tape. I promise you're going to be shocked by how not good it actually is and how much he actually loses. The real concern for me when it comes to Zeus is he going to be as protected on HLE as he was on T1? For a lot of last year, he ended up getting protected in the early game because of the way that they wanted to path around topside and leave Guma kind of on an island. That's not really what HLE like to do with Viper. I think Peanut could theoretically do that, and Viper could very much survive. It would just be a very different style. That's really the only concern with Zeus fitting in here. I think for the most part, this is obviously a huge mechanical upgrade. I think Zeus is better than Doran in terms of his ability to 1v1, and when he wins a lot harder than someone like Doran, but a take that I don't know how popular it's going to be now that he's on T1. Doran, at least at the LCK level, has been like the pinnacle of consistency and the pinnacle of success over the past couple of years. I know people will talk about his international failures, but again, this is not an international grades video. This is an LCK grades video, and this guy's been nothing short of a top 2 top laner, basically regardless of who else is with him in that discussion for the past 3 to 4 years, and you know, losing that consistency is certainly something that I'm taking into account. Doran, at least domestically, is a more consistent player than Zeus is, or he has been over the course of the last 2 years. That being said, Zeus's highs are significantly higher, and if you are able to tap into that more frequently, especially if he's playing strong side for this team, this is just going to be an upgrade. You certainly raised your ceiling, and I think this went from a team that, you know, was good, but maybe wasn't quite good enough to, like, win the World Championships to a team that very much could win the World Championships. I'm certainly not trying to say that this team got worse by any means. I do think that Zeus is a good addition, and there was a reason he was super highly prioritized. I just worry about it being this direct upgrade that I think a lot of people want it to be. I think there are going to be moments where it looks like an upgrade, and there are going to be moments where it looks like a downgrade, and you just kind of have to hope that you can balance those out, and I think Zeus will be better when it matters more. And so generally speaking, I'm considering this a change because, like I said, there's going to probably be some good and bad with this transition, but overall, this is a great move for Hanwha Life. You've got maybe the most valuable top laner in the world in terms of age and contract and general upside, and you've paired him up with players that I think are incredibly talented across every single role. You have one of the best junglers in the world, you know, one of the best mid laners, one of the best bot laners, one of the best supports. Like, you are top tier at literally every single position. This is a team that won the LCK, that only lost to a World Finals team at Worlds, and got better, you know, theoretically this offseason. This is going to be one of the scariest teams in the world, and I would expect them to be even more competitive than they were in 2024. But then moving on to our second place team from the LCK last year, and it is the team that kind of ran the LCK for a majority of the year. It's Gen.G, and I think a lot of people are obviously disappointed by another semifinals finish for Gen.G at Worlds. Not that semifinals is the worst thing in the world, but there's definitely some concern that this team needs to make some kind of change in order to get themselves over the hump. And you know what? I think there's a real chance that they made that change this offseason. We'll go ahead and obviously talk about it, but I know people are already going to be talking about the grades. I'm just going to get it out of the way at the start. Yes, Chovy's an A+ player. You want to talk about how Choky exists? I know there's going to be somebody in my comment section that haha Choky, and then whatever spam post they want to put, you know, do your thing. It's cool. You boost the engagement of the video. I really appreciate it. But at the end of the day, he won both of the MVPs last year. He dominated domestically. He won a trophy, and he's won a ton of trophies domestically over the past couple of years. I once again have to reiterate, this is not a Worlds ranking. This is an LCK ranking. And when it comes to LCK value, there's not a player that has been more valuable to winning in the LCK over the past 3 years than Chovy. There just hasn't been. And so he is the only player in this video to be getting an A+ grade, and I think every single team in the league would give up everything they have, maybe with the exception of T1, to bring in a player like Chovy. And so obviously, there's no other way to say it. Anybody who's watched Chovy play knows why I have him as an A+. People who, you know, go on Reddit and look at the analysis and don't actually watch the games, they don't like Chovy, and I get it. Like, the Leaguepedia page would lead you to believe that he's not the best player in the world, but I assure you, gameplay-wise, it's all there. I mean, mechanics, like team play, the ability to understand where he needs to be in the mid-game, like, he's just elite at everything. There's nothing that he is bad at, and when it comes to ranking him in an LCK context, there's just no player that is going to bring as much value as Chovy has over the past couple of years. And so yes, to get it out of the way first, he is my only A+ player, because again, I know that's going to bring some controversy down in the comment section, but as for the rest of the team, it's all pretty standard, I think, for what a lot of people would consider them right now. Their lineup is, of course, in 2025 looking like Keen in the top lane, Canyon in the jungle, Chovy in the mid lane, Ruler at AD carry, and Duro at support. The other two members that are coming back, Keen and Canyon, I'm really excited that they were able to keep Keen. That was obviously something that was pretty highly prioritized in the offseason for them. It really looked like Chovy, Keen, like all of them could be leaving Gen.G in the offseason. It certainly didn't look like it was going to be the most consistent offseason in the world at the start for Gen, but they were able to retain all three of their top side, which is huge, because this is the best top side in the world when everything is clicking. Keen was easily the best top laner in the LCK last year, and it really wasn't all that close. His laning stats completely outperformed everybody, and obviously the eye test passed that. He's already a better team fighter than he is a laner, and he's the best laner in the league in terms of top laners, and so he's the most valuable top laner. He comes in as an A. He is arguably the best top laner in the world. I would go with Bin, personally. I think that that's a take that has aged really well, but Keen is more than in the conversation, right? Like, he's right up there, top 2, top 3 at the absolute worst, depending on where you want to put a couple of other players. But Canyon coming back, I think, is also a positive. Somehow, I think his year last year is a bit underrated. I think a lot of people are talking about how he wasn't good on tanks. I think that that is incredibly overstated. I think he was perfectly fine on tanks. He was a top 2 or 3 jungler in the LCK on Maokai and Sejuani last year. He just wasn't number 1. He was the best jungler in the world, a top 3 player in the world on carry junglers, and that's kind of what you're getting with Canyon. I think the thing that really encouraged me is that Chovy was very willing to take a step back in terms of early game pressure to allow Canyon to develop resources and for them to team fight a lot in the mid game, to be able to fight over objectives and to skirmish a lot more frequently. You know, Chovy has shown that he can really perform well in a lot of different team styles depending on who his jungler is, and you know, there was some concern, at least from me at the beginning of last year, whether or not Canyon and Chovy styles would mesh well together, but they absolutely did. I think going from Peanut to Canyon is about as drastic of a change as you can get for Gen.G, but it very much worked out, and Canyon to me is still arguably the most valuable jungler in the world. Again, I know people are going to criticize his ability to play tanks, but it's not nearly as bad as people say it is. It's very overblown. I think just because people want to look for issues with players. They don't want players to be really good. They want to try and make it a nuanced discussion. Canyon's really good. It doesn't have to be like overthought. He's still pretty good at tanks. He's gotten better than what he was like 2 or 3 years ago in those roles. He is better as a carry player. That's always going to be true for a player like Canyon, who just feels more natural in that role, but it's not like he's bad in other contexts. This is the best top side in the world when they're all clicking, and now you're bringing in the best ADC of all time, in my opinion, in Ruler. You're bringing him back, I should say, to Gen.G, kind of the prodigal son of this organization. Left a couple of years ago, got replaced by a rookie 17-year-old that went on to become one of the best AD carries in the world, and now you have the luxury of kind of getting your pick of the litter and choosing whether or not to bring him back. You make the decision to move on from Pays and to move back to Ruler. I don't hate this decision at all. I'm only listing it as a change because Pays, performance-wise, has been the best performing AD carry in the world over the past couple of years. I don't know if I would generally rate Pays as, like, you know, a top 2 or 3 AD carry in the world. He's certainly in the conversation, but I personally rank Ruler a bit higher, even if Ruler had a worse 2024 than Pays did. Now, that being said, people are going to undervalue Ruler's 2024 because JDG did not make Worlds. Let me assure you, Ruler was not the reason that JD Gaming did not make Worlds last year. In fact, a lot of people, you know, talked pretty heavily in the LPL community about him being elo stuck on that JDG team with Yagao, just performing so poorly down the stretch. Him coming back here to Gen.G should be a perfect fit. I can't believe that we're going to get to see Chovy and Ruler in 2025 with Canyon, with Keen. Like, it's just such a ridiculous lineup in terms of the names and the legends that they have kind of accumulated, and you know, him coming back here, I think, is going to be fine. Again, maybe I would have considered keeping Pays around just because he's 18, 19 years old and has performed like a top 10 player in the world both of the 2 years that he's played competitively at the top level, but how are you ever going to turn down the opportunity to bring Ruler in? For my money, he's still, you know, one of, if not the best AD carry in the world, and I think he's going to be in a better circumstance, a better situation in 2025, and I think he's very much going to remind people of that. If he wins back-to-back MVPs, do not be surprised. I think that's very much in the cards for Ruler and for Gen.G if everything were to go right. But he's getting paired up with probably the most unproven part of this team, and that's bringing in Duro from FearX here to replace Lehens. Now, this reminds me so much of Lehens getting replaced the first time on Gen.G by Delight, them bringing him in from Bro, and, you know, not really understanding or knowing what we were going to get out of Delight in that year one. Turns out Delight's really good, and they had a really good eye for that, and he goes on to be one of the best supports in the world. He still is one of the best supports in the world. The thing that makes that story crazy is that I think Duro is better as a prospect than what Delight was. Duro has already shown more on FearX than Delight showed on Bro before he was signed by Gen.G, at least in my opinion, and I'm a huge fan of Duro. I talked about it a lot towards the end of last year, where I truly believe that if he had played even like 3/4 of the split for FearX, he would have easily been an all-pro. Like, he was a top 3 support basically the entire time he was playing on a team that wasn't particularly good. Like, they weren't bad. They were, you know, average. They were fighting for that number 6 spot to try to make it into playoffs, and they did end up getting it, and Duro was a big reason for that, but he came in and really revitalized that FearX team. He was the one kind of leading them into a lot of positive situations, and I really love this addition for Gen.G. Now, it is a risk, because you're going from Lehens, who has proven himself to be one of the best supports in the world, to Duro, who's played really well for like 2 months of a year, and that's really the only tape we have of him at a high level. But if Gen.G trusts him in the same way that I believed in them when they signed Delight, and I trusted that they were going to figure something out and at least be a good bot lane, and obviously they overperformed my expectations, I trust them even more bringing on someone like Duro. If he's one of the top 3 supports in the world by the end of the year, I'm not going to be surprised. It's honestly kind of there on tape. His tape is truly excellent. The only reason he's getting a B is because the sample size is just so ridiculously low that I can't reasonably put him above like a B, but his tape is crazy. Like, he was awesome for FearX, and I really love this addition. If you are going to go in a youthful direction, if you are going to go for a player that's a little bit more unproven with the attempt to try and take like a big swing and hit a home run and try to bring in somebody that can be like a huge game changer for significantly less money to allow you to go pick up Ruler and to bring back Keen and Chovy and all these free agents, then I think Duro is almost 100% the best possible option they could have gone with, maybe outside of like Plata on DRX, who I also really like. So really, really interested in this addition. Ruler and Duro, I think, should be one of the more fun bot lanes to watch in terms of their playstyle, but this is once again going to be a team that competes to just run the LCK. I think there is a really strong chance that they are just the best team in Korea, at least domestically. Again, you know, I'm not going to sit here and try and claim anything internationally, even though Chovy won MSI last year, because the Choky comments are definitely already there, but like, this is a team that is going to look to be even better than what they were last year, and from a grades perspective, I think it's pretty reasonable to expect that as well. Then moving on now to our third team, and we're still not at the World Champions just yet. That's just how things went in the LCK last year, but the team coming in third was, of course, Dplus KIA, and they are also making a couple of changes. Nobody just went into the next year with the exact same roster. Everybody felt like they needed to do some sort of turnover in some way, shape, or form, and DK really kind of both going back to basics, kind of getting back to the roots of, you know, what their success came from in the first place, and also really trying to invest in a core of young players that they brought through their system that have very much overperformed expectations so far in the Challengers League, which I'm excited to talk about. Their lineup in 2025, of course, is looking like Siwoo in the top lane, Lucid in the jungle, Showmaker in the mid lane, aiming at AD carry, and Barrel at support. The 3 members that are returning are the 3 best performing members from this team last year. Showmaker, obviously, the core of this team. I think there's an argument to be made that he is an A- caliber player. I think he's underrated by the community at this point. He has been given so much responsibility for Dplus KIA in terms of being able to separate this team from just a middle-of-the-pack roster, and he has very much stepped up to the plate and delivered that over and over and over again. Like, he is the pinnacle of, you know, good player on an average team, great player, I should say, on an average team. I genuinely think we're at the point where we're underrating him. I think he's won a lot more games for this team over the past couple of years than he will ever get credit for. His tape is excellent, even if the community would like you to believe otherwise. But the other players, you know, you bring back, I think that there are still a lot of positives with them, but a lot more inconsistencies than you're going to get out of, you know, Showmaker, in my opinion. Aiming is going to be the one that people are saying is too low with a B grade because his stats were unbelievable last year. When you just go look at his, like, you know, GOL page, it's ridiculous. It's actually insane, the numbers he was able to put up on this team, but that doesn't show up on tape. I've said it a bunch of times over the course of the last year or so. He's just the most passive early game player you could possibly ask for with his skill set. Like, he has the talent to be able to dominate 2v2, and his numbers look really fine. Like, they generally are okay, but at the end of the day, like, on tape, he is just not not pressing advantages. He's not creating his own situation down in the bot lane. He's really reliant on Lucid spending a ton of time on the bottom side of the map. And then last year, Moham coming in and being this really aggressive, like engage style support in the middle of the year, or Kellen really shot calling early on in the year. And I don't think he would be as good in a different circumstance. I think he's benefited a lot by the fact that the rest of this team is super active. And I just don't think a lot of it is his doing directly. Now, that being said, we saw last year that you put Aiming in a good spot. You put him in a good situation where he has a good surrounding core that can enable him and he can perform like one of the best AD carries in the LCK. I'm just not going to grade him value-wise as one of the best AD carries in the LCK, because if you took him or if you took one of the top 3 AD carries in the region and you put them on a bottom tier team, I think he would easily perform the worst out of all 3. I just don't think he's the type of player that would carry a bad team in that kind of way, or like elevate a bad team in that kind of way. But he is valuable for a team like DK because he's so good at playing within structure and so good at receiving resources. He's a great team fighter, a truly great late game team fighter, but that's always been his biggest problem. I don't even think he's quite as active as he was in like 2023 on KT Rolster. I think he's reverted a lot to what he was like early on in his career, specifically in the LPL, where he was just exclusively somebody who was given resources in the mid game to try and team fight his way out of bad situations in the late game. You know, I think it's a fine role to have, but just not something that I would consider a B+. Also, he is inconsistent. He fits the B model of having good stretches and having bad stretches, but that also very much applies to Lucid. Talk about an up and down first year in the LCK. I was very critical of Lucid in the spring split. I genuinely do not think he was good at all in spring. I think he was a bottom 3-ish jungler in the LCK in the spring split, and they won kind of in spite of him, but he figured something out in that playoff run in the spring split that he was able to carry over into summer, where he was actually really good for this team. That level of progression and development is exactly what you want to see from a young player brought up here, and I'm expecting even more going into next year. I just can't give him that B+ tag until I see it, you know, be a little bit more consistent. If he comes out at the start of spring and just continues, or winter, I should say now, and just continues to look excellent for this team, I'm going to be all in on him as like a B+, you know, maybe an A- if everything really were to go right type of player moving forward. He could be one of the better junglers in the world if everything were to go right, because again, he's shown flashes of that. It's just really been about the consistency for him. It's a small sample size so far. Half of his first year was really, really bad, and so I just don't want to overreact to some really good games in the summer split. Again, if him and Showmaker developed some sort of chemistry in the middle of the year that they were able to really kind of push forward on, and if that carries over into 2025, then yeah, I'm going to be pretty all in on Lucid, because again, that summer tape is excellent, but I just don't want to anoint him before we see the consistency. And then the 2 changes to talk about, you've got a promotion and you've got a re-signing here. We'll start with Beryl. I don't really want to go like super in depth on this. If anybody has followed the channel for like a millisecond, you know my thoughts on Beryl. I'm not going to say he's overhyped, because I think that that's generally unfair. I think he deserves his reputation for what he was in his prime, but people very much talk about him as if he has been playing at that level the past 2 years. He has not. He was awful in 2023. Hell, he was really bad in the regular season in 2022 as well, before figuring it out at Worlds and winning Worlds again on DRX, but he was horrible in 2023, genuinely one of the worst players in the LCK, at least in terms of my grading scale, and then he was fine in 2024. I think that there were some pluses and minuses. I'm not sure if it was his influence that caused Def to kind of lose his mind and start playing so much more aggressively, but for whatever reason, that KT bot lane was super volatile. You can live with that. You know, there's worse performances than what Beryl gave in 2024, but he wasn't elite by any stretch, and he really hasn't been elite ever since he left Dplus KIA the first time. I know, again, people are going to point out 2022, oh, he won Worlds, he was great at the World Championships. This is an LCK ranking. I'm not ranking him for Worlds, I'm ranking him for the regular season, where he loses focus a lot of the time. He is going to probably be better than Moham. Moham is just a very limited player in terms of his playstyle. Great engage support, but not really somebody that can, you know, threaten in a lot of other ways. Very much team fight, you know, oriented and focused in terms of where he wants to put a lot of his attention. I think Beryl is going to be better for the team overall in that sense, but the consistency is not there with Beryl. Like, you're just going to have to accept that there are going to be, like, many games throughout the year that he just completely ints and runs away and just loses for his team, and I'm not sure how well that synergizes with a player like Aiming, who does want to be a little bit more passive, but best case scenario, you're getting a very similar bot lane to that 2022 DRX team, where you have an AD carry that tries to be as stable as possible to play for team fights, you know, and then have Beryl just all over the map, playing for Lucid and playing for Showmaker. That's probably the idea of bringing him back here, especially because you're pairing him up with, you know, a couple of younger players on the top top side of the map, but also being an in-game leader can definitely help. I think having a player like Beryl who's very willing to take charge in terms of calls and commands is kind of what they've been looking for, and kind of the reason they struggled after they benched Kellen last year. So we'll see if that ends up being fine. I'm pretty neutral about this change. I think it will be fine for them. And then Siwoo on the top side, this is one I'm much more excited about. You're moving on from Kingin, who I think is a pretty solid player at this point in time, has clearly shown himself to be a borderline top 4, top 5 top laner at the LCK level. He's going to be in that conversation for All-Pro basically every single split, but Siwoo I think could be even better than that. This guy has ridiculous talent. I think it's crazy how frequent it is that these players coming out of the DK system just continue to impress in the Challengers League, but Siwoo was the best player for their Challengers League team, at least in my opinion. Saint got a lot of the credit and got a lot of the hype. I think Siwoo was better, and I continue to be really high on a lot of the top laners that are coming out of the LCK Challengers League right now, and I think he really could make an impact year one. I like him about as much as I liked Lucid coming out last year from that Challengers League system, perhaps even a bit more in terms of what his current ability could be. It reminds me a lot of how I talked about Perfect going into last year. Now, Perfect had his struggles, but generally I think he did fine for year number 1 in the LCK. Siwoo is a player that I expect to come in and be a positive for this team basically from day one. I think he will be fine on the top side of the map, and while this is listed as a change because I do think you are getting a little bit lower in terms of a proven commodity, Kingin has just been so reliable in terms of what he's been over the past couple of years. I think Siwoo's upside is more than worth taking a punt on. There's going to be some conversation here about whether or not this should have been Thanatos, but honestly, I kind of like Siwoo's tape better than I like Thanatos' tape. That's just a personal opinion. I don't really think they're all that far apart, but clearly DK kind of agrees with me because they were at the very least willing to sell Thanatos to North America in the middle of the year last year because they had Siwoo kind of waiting in the wings. And so hopefully he ends up working out well for this team. I like his tape, but I've said that before about LCK prospects. I've said it a million times on this channel, but the jump from the Challengers League to the LCK is the largest jump, in my opinion, between a tier 2 and a tier 1 region in the world. I don't think the NACL to LTA jump is that big. I don't think the ERL or LFL or whatever you want to say to the LEC jump is that big, and I don't think that the LDL to the LPL jump is that big. I think this is, Korea's always been the region where it's the hardest to adapt to tier 1, in year 1. We saw that last year with Lucid struggling early. Siwoo could go through those same kinds of struggles, very similar to someone like Perfect, but I think the talent hopefully should shine through. So I think that, the team had a pretty solid offseason. I really don't think they're all that different from last year. Perhaps you have a bit more upside on the top side of the map, but this will likely be a team that continues to compete for the 3rd or the 4th seed going to Worlds. Doesn't really feel like a team that's going to be able to contend for the top of the standings for winning the LCK, but they certainly will be around the Worlds conversation. And I really don't think the offseason changed their trajectory too much. But now, finally, we are allowed to get to our world champions from last year. It's crazy that it takes until the 4th team in the LCK to do that, but that's the depth of talent. It is, of course, T1, the perennial world champions, it would seem, in League of Legends, the perennial team at the top of the standings, and very similar to Hanwha Life, this is going to be a relatively quick section in comparison to some of the other teams because there just really aren't a lot of changes. Really, the only thing to justify are some of the grades on the screen, but even this year, I really don't think there's all that much to justify in terms of these grades. These feel pretty entirely accurate, so let's go ahead and go over their 2025 roster. Is of course looking like Doran in the top lane, Owner in the jungle, Faker in the mid lane, Gumayushi at AD carry, and Keria at support. After multiple years of running back the same 5, the same roster, they have finally decided to make a change. Now, it wasn't their design to make a change. Reportedly, they offered Zeus to come back, and it was a sweepstakes between a couple of teams. I know the LPL was involved a bit, but really between Hanwha Life and T1, and it seems like Zeus did choose Hanwha Life. I'm sure he got a pretty big bag to go over there to HLE, especially with there being a salary cap here in the LCK, but T1 has to pivot and they have to move in a different direction, and that means bringing in Doran, and this certainly makes a lot of the T1 comment sections a lot funnier in hindsight because of just how critical they've been of Doran over the past couple of years, how much they've ragged on him for not being good enough in big pivotal moments. But I think this is fine in terms of a consolation prize. I think Doran is a completely capable top laner at the LCK level, and regardless of whether or not you like Doran as a player, he has been been the most successful top laner in terms of domestic success, maybe ever in LCK history. All this guy does is win the LCK. He won it on Hanwha Life last year. He was perennially winning it on Gen.G before he left that organization. This guy just kind of wins a lot of things, and he is really good domestically in the playoffs. His world struggles have been, very well documented, and I'm certainly not going to sit here and say that I don't see where people are coming from there, but he deserves a lot of credit for being one of the most stable domestic top laners that the LCK has seen in many, many years. This is not a role that has been particularly stable over the past few years, and Doran's kind of been the opposite of that. Yes, he's had bad games every once in a while, but he continues to just generally be a positive, not only as a weak side player, but even as a strong side player, as we saw in 2023 when he was on Gen.G. It wasn't quite as much of that on Hanwha Life last year. He was definitely a lot more weak side, but Doran is perfectly fine as an addition here. He does not give you the upside, in my opinion, that Zeus gives you, which is why he is a grade lower. Zeus is in the A's and Doran is not, because I just don't think Doran is ever going to break through as like a top 5 player in the world in the same way that I think anybody in the A's could at any given moment, but I do think that Doran is good enough for you to be able to win worlds with, like regardless of whether or not he ends up, showing up in clutch time. As long as he plays his game, he should be good enough for you to be able to push forward with, and it's not like the rest of this team got any worse. You're in basically the exact same spot. Faker and KIA continue to come in as the highest valued players on the team. Perhaps Faker deserves that A+ valuation. I think that that's generally fair because he is kind of valued as an A+ asset purely off of the marketing that you would get from signing Faker, and he's the GOAT. Like, the value of Faker is incredibly high. I just want to kind of give some credence to the idea that he was kind of bad for parts of last year, and I clearly do think that the wrist injuries are bothering him. It's not something that I'm super concerned about. I don't think it's something that's going to prohibit him from being his best, like, at the most important times of the year, as we saw last year at Worlds, obviously, but I do think that there are going to be stretches from this point onwards in his career where he's just not perfect every single split, and you just kind of have to live with that. Again, his summer split was very, very contentious in terms of the way he played. His mental decisions were really killing him throughout a lot of the summer split. I don't know if it was just him trying to force a lot of things when this team wasn't performing particularly well or what, but there were just a lot of mental errors throughout last year that I think he could have cleaned up on. That being said, you want to give Faker an A+? Sure, man, it's Faker. Like, who am I to stop you? And then KIA is the other player getting an A. I continue to be KIA's biggest fan and biggest supporter. This guy is just one of the best supports of all time. Really, there's no other argument at this point. He is a meta definer. He is the first person to come out and try new interesting things when a new season starts, and especially with a new map happening here in 2025, KIA is the person I'm looking at to see if he can find any sort of weird innovation to be able to make the early game a lot easier for T1, as he seems to do basically every single spring split. I feel really good about KIA, and there's hardly a support you can find in the world that you would rather have on a team to try to win. Outside of that, you have Gumayusi coming in as an A-. I think you could give him an A. Again, another player that I think you could raise the grade of. In fact, he probably played closer to an A last year. I just feel like the cluster of AD carries are all so similar that to me, it's really hard for me to say that any of them is like individually specifically better than the rest. That being said, if you wanted to give them all A, like Viper, Gumayusi, Ruler, if you want to give them all an A grade, I think that that's relatively fair. But right now I have Gumayusi at A- because, last year, while it was kind of a breakout year in my opinion, while it was the best year of his career, a breakout seems kind of superfluous considering he was already a world champion, but because I think last year was the best year of his career, I think if there was ever a time to justify moving him from A- to A, it's this offseason. And if he goes out and performs even half of the way that he did in summer split of last year, then yeah, he will be an A by the end of the year. But throughout basically all of his career up until that point, he has reminded me a lot of a player that I've compared him to 100 million times over, and that is Gala over in the LPL. I think they're very similar in terms of how they end up playing, which is to say they can win lane, they can be dominant, but they're very team-oriented. They will do whatever they need to do in order to lock in and be the best possible player for their team. If that means carrying like he was in the summer split, that's great. If that means being the player that takes all of the resources away from himself and gives them to his teammates like he kind of has been throughout the rest of his career, then he can do that well. He's just a very versatile player. He's going to be good basically no matter what situation you put him in, and he has shown he can be a primary option on a team that does want to try to make worlds. And so yeah, I feel great about Gumayusi. If you want to put him at A, go ahead. For now he's an A-, but he's really very much like right on the border. And then you have Owner at an A-. He actually moves up from a B+ to an A-. He's been a B+ basically his entire tenure for me on T1. Again, I think he showed a lot more last year individually than maybe he has in previous years. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that Faker and Zeus were just not playing particularly well for all of summer. And Owner had his own struggles, but I honestly felt a lot better about Owner coming out of 2024 than I did at any other point. He was amazing at Worlds, arguably the best player at the tournament overall, and that doesn't take like a huge factor into account, but adding that on to a year where he was already really good, I think is definitely something that plays into my mind. And I think at this point, I just have to acknowledge that at any point, Owner can be a top 5 player in the world, and it's not out of the realm of possibility. I've talked a lot about how I think playing with players like Zeus and Faker and KIA have made Owner's job a lot easier, and he doesn't really have to do all that much in the early game. He gets, a much easier ride than a lot of the other players that are kind of around his skill level. But even with that being said, his performance is just so high at this point that I can't really deny it. So Doran being the only change, you feel good about that, and it's T1. I've talked about them for 3 straight years at this point. You know my thoughts on this team. They're going to be fine domestically. Maybe they got a little bit worse going from Zeus to Doran, but I don't even think that that's necessarily true. I think your floor could have just raised even if your ceiling was a bit lowered, but really the important part for this team is not domestically. It's qualifying for Worlds and then doing what they can to try to get that three-peat. They are the back-to-back world champions. They have by far won the most of any organization ever. Faker has made more world finals than he's missed throughout his career. There's nothing left for a lot of these players to accomplish other than to secure their, GOAT conversation right next to Faker. So that's really what the goal is now, and we'll see if the change ends up mattering at all for them. But now we get to move on to the team that missed out on Worlds by 1 game, and honestly, now that we're out of the top 4, I'm more excited to talk in this video because these changes are very intriguing, at least in my opinion. I think everybody from here on out certainly made some interesting decisions, and that starts with KT Rolster. Of course, 1 game away from making it to Worlds, just barely getting knocked out by their telecom rivals in T1, and T1 obviously going on to win Worlds shows that this was a pretty good KT Rolster team, and I think there's an argument to be made that their upside got even higher this offseason. I think that, they made a couple of good decisions, a couple of bad decisions. I'm not entirely sold on this team as like a guaranteed top 4, but we'll go ahead and talk about it. There's a lot of nuance to discuss here with KT. Their lineup is looking like perfect in the top lane, Cuz in the jungle, BDD in the mid lane, Dekdom at AD carry, and Wei at support. I think, obviously, the core of this team has stayed, the core being BDD. Like, he is the guy for KT Rolster. He's clearly the player that they want to build around. He was the only remaining player last year to come back, and he does it once again, although he's joined by his top laner this time around. BDD had a very interesting 2024. He was miserably bad in spring, kind of similar to what I talked about with Lucid, and then was amazing down the stretch of summer. Like, the back half of summer going into playoffs, and then, obviously, the regional qualifiers. He was arguably the second best player in the LCK, only behind Chovy in that stretch, in my opinion. And maybe Pays, like, I don't know, you can really name more than 2 or 3 people that were definitely better than BDD at the end of 2024, and hopefully he carries that into 2025. The only reason he's getting a B+ is because he has shown at this point to be hyper inconsistent when it comes to actually being one of the best mid laners in the world, and that's something crazy to say about a player who has been around the block as much as BDD has been. And so it's just really interesting. He's kind of fit into this mold now of being this really inconsistently phenomenal player, very similar to how I talked about Showmaker. And Showmaker also came in as the B+ grade. I think Showmaker and BDD have very similar grades in my opinion. Whoever you want to put above the other, I think, is entirely fair. But again, this team's going to be very happy to bring him back as a core player. And they are bringing back Perfect in the top lane as well. It didn't always seem like this was going to be the #1 option. I know they considered a couple of other players for this role. Keen obviously was a big, free agent, ends up re-signing with Gen.G, and so they keep Perfect around here. Even Doran was considered here, but T1 ended up scooping him up. I think Perfect is more than good enough to be able to start at the LCK level. He still has a lot of inconsistencies, which is why he comes in as a B- for me and not like a B. But I do think that, by the end of the year, I would expect him to be like a B or a B+. I think he's going to be one of the more consistent top laners in the league. I talked about it a lot at the beginning of last year, but his Challengers League tape was exceptional. I thought it was better than Thanatos's coming out of 2023, and I still think his LCK tape looks really good. I think people are overselling how not good some of his bad tape is, and I think his good tape is excellent. He was really good in the summer split for this team, and so I feel good about bringing him back. I think that's absolutely the right decision. You don't promote him and just replace him after 1 year with the upside that he has individually as a player, especially mechanically. But every other change, you've got some positives and some negatives. We'll start with the positive. The big upgrade for me is going from Pyosik to Cuz. I know some people aren't going to look at this as like a straight upgrade because especially in spring, Pyosik had some really phenomenal stretches where he looked really good for KT. The start of the year was incredible for him, but he just tapered off and got worse and worse, and that's kind of generally been the trend with Pyosik. You just can never really rely on him being good throughout the entirety of a year for any team. team. That's just kind of who he is individually as a player, is a very inconsistently very good player, and Cuz is much more consistent. I think he's going to offer a lot more. I think bringing him back here to KT was a no-brainer if you were able to get him. I'm listing this as an upgrade because I do think that Cuz is just more valuable than Pyosik is at this point in his career. Cuz was good on KDF last year, maybe wasn't quite as good as he had been on some previous teams, but he also was playing with a worse surrounding cast, and so I think getting him back here to KT, getting him back with someone like BDD in the mid lane, I think is going to be a big positive for him. I think he's going to be one of the, 3 to 4 best junglers in the LCK once again. And then you have a straight downgrade in the AD carry role for me, and that's going from Deft to Dectum. I like Dectum. I think he's actually been undervalued throughout basically his entire career. I talked about this, obviously, when he was on Nongshim, but even going to, like, the Dplus KIA era, I thought him and Kellen were never given the credit that they deserved as a duo for actually being very stable and very solid for that team. He goes to DRX and has a bunch of things happen to him. That team is a complete disaster, has some wrist injuries that or I think it was elbow injuries that keep him out for extended periods of time, and then he eventually goes to the LPL last year to play for Fun Plus Phoenix, a team that had no expectations. I had them in my bottom 3 in my preseason power rankings, and what do? They're a consistent playoff team, a team that was, I guess a couple of breaks away from potentially like trying to make Worlds, and Dectum actually played really well alongside Life last year, and because of that he gets his, call up back to the LCK, if you will, and I really don't want it to seem like I'm low on him. I don't want it to seem like I dislike Dectum. I just think that there were better options available. Apparently, if the rumors are to be believed, they chose Dectum over Pays, and that is a really, really bold call in my opinion. I'm not sure if that's entirely accurate. Perhaps, JD Gaming had already gotten to Pays and he just made that decision, and Dectum was like their third option essentially behind Ruler and behind Pays, but whatever the reason, like getting Dectum here is not the slam dunk home run AD carry move. He's going to be a really stable middle of the pack, like mid-table AD carry, and if that's what you're looking for, if you're looking for someone around the level of like a Teddy, then Dectum very much offers that. He can be a stable presence, and especially because he's probably not going to be asked to be the primary carry on this team, I think that can be fine. I just think you probably could have done better in this position, and I think your contemporaries did do better. I do not think they have one of the strongest bot lanes in the region right now, which I think could be a bit of a problem. That's why it's considered a downgrade, because Deft I think is just better than Dectum. Obviously Deft retired, so you can't blame them for losing him, but this is getting worse in that position, even if I don't hate Dectum. And then the interesting one, the change here, is going to be going from Barrel to Wei. I really like this decision. He is the only player that you're actually promoting from the dominant KT Rolster Challengers team from last year that, basically had the Golden Road in Tier 2 in the LCK, if you want to consider it that. But 4 players from that team are getting promoted to the LCK. Again, Wei is the only one actually staying on KT Rolster. I guess Zinni is also still on KT Rolster because it's clear that they are prepping him for something bigger. He was the best player on that team, but he is remaining in the Challengers League, at least for now. But I'm excited about Wei. I thought the bot lane was pretty fun to watch. It wasn't exactly the star lane for KTC for me, at least in my opinion. Jungle mid was definitely what caught my eye a bit more in terms of the way they ended up playing that out, but Wei is certainly good enough in my opinion to really come in and make an impact day number 1. My only concern is that I'm not sold that he is immediately going to be like a game breaker, especially because, again, as I talk about a lot, you have to be like a ridiculous talent to get a B as a rookie coming into the LCK with just how hard that transition has proven to be, and he's not coming in and playing with like the strongest laning support in the entire universe in Dectum. He's a good laner, and generally speaking, laning was a strength for Dectum in the LPL, as was teamfighting, but I don't think this is like the easiest transition in the universe, and I don't think Dectum's going to make it easier. I think a lot of this is going to be on whether or not he can play with Cuz and whether or not they can develop a good chemistry together. But Wei individually as a player I like. I just don't know if he's going to be better than what Barrel was for this team in year number 1, especially because I think generally the bot lane is getting worse. And so I think you're getting better in the jungle. I think that makes your jungle mid even stronger. Cuz and BDD are going to be one of the more stable, consistently good jungle mids, or at least you would assume that, so long as BDD doesn't have that weird stretch of the year where he's bad. And then everything else, like maybe you get really great performances out of players like Perfect and Wei that are really young and have a lot of really high upside, and maybe Dectum is that perfect weak side AD carry that you need to be able to play through the middle of the map and to play for more late game teamfight situations. I just don't know if I love the upside of the Dectum signing, and I think it does kind of hamper a bit of my excitement about this team moving into 2025, but as we know, for KT Rolster, the less excitement you have, the better they're probably going to do, and so maybe that's a good thing overall. But I think this team is fine. I don't think they're going to be world beaters, and I think they're going to be in contention for trying to make Worlds. I just don't really know if they're going to be in that top 4 position. But then moving on now to our final playoff and regional qualifier team from last year. It is, of course, BNK FearX. And this is a team that I'm a little bit less excited about than maybe others in terms of their offseason. I don't think it's the worst offseason in the world. I just think this team has a lot to prove to me in terms of replicating, I guess, their success from this past year, being a top 6 team, being a team that was technically in the regional qualifiers. I think that there are some moves that they made that feel like side grades at best or downgrades at worst, and some punts on younger players or a younger player that I'm not entirely sold on just yet. I think that there is a lot for this team to prove going into 2025 that maybe some other teams don't have to prove as much, especially with all of these bottom tier teams kind of getting better in the offseason. So let's go ahead and get into it. There's quite a bit to talk about in terms of their offseason. Their lineup is looking like Clear in the top lane, Raptor in the jungle, Vikla in the mid lane, Diablo in the bot lane, and Kellen at support. Some good and some bad, I would say, overall with this offseason. I do like retaining the top side of the map. I think that that is generally an okay decision. Raptor was a lot better last split than people are going to give him credit for. I think people were frustrated because Willer is a really good player, and it feels like he was just kind of stuck on the Challengers League team to make room for Raptor, who's kind of a worse version of Willer, and I agree with that. I still continue to agree with that. I think that Willer is a better player than Raptor. I think that they're very similar in terms of their playstyles. They're both very feast or famine. They both take on very much like a carry role so long as they're not surrounded by a ton of stars, and for the most part, that was okay for FearX. When Willer was on the team, he was kind of the one winning games for them, but when Raptor replaced him, he very much stepped into that role. Basically, every game that FearX won in terms of, damage carries was coming through the jungle. Obviously, Duro was exceptionally good for this team, and I think he was the best player by far down the stretch for them, which is why his grade is the highest, even though he played the least for this team. But Raptor was a big, piece for why they were able to win games, and I think he could continuously get better. That being said, I think the jungle position got better across the league, and so perhaps we're not going to see quite as good of a year from Raptor. Again, a very feast or famine style. His losses are really bad, but for now, I'm going to try to keep him at a C+. I think it's fine that he has a starting job, and I definitely feel fine about running him back. I just don't love it. It's not going to be the best move in the world, and that's the same thing for Clear in the top lane. Clear is another player that I think is just generally fine. He has proven to be, a good top laner, a slightly below average top laner at the LCK level. He's never going to be someone that blows you away in terms of his ability to win matchups that he shouldn't win, but when he's put in good spots, he can take advantage of it. I'm really not all that impressed with Clear. He's had a couple of really good games and really good weeks in the past, but overall, he's kind of just been a guy on this team. I understand why they want to continue with him. He was a highly touted prospect, and, he does have good mechanics, but, I don't think he's ever going to turn into a superstar at this level, and then everybody else here is kind of a punt. Honestly, there are a couple of buy low options here in a promotion for FearX that I'm interested to see how it goes in. The mid and support are both buy low options, but I'm much higher on Kellen coming in here. Anybody who follows the channel knows that I'm actually pretty high on Kellen, at least in comparison to what the general consensus seems to be. I see a lot of people talking about him as if he's this bad support, as if he shouldn't be starting in the LCK. He has done nothing but make teams better when he is on them. You can argue about his consistency or about his mechanics, which aren't exactly the best in the entire world, but what we have seen so consistently with teams like Dplus KIA is that when Kellen is in, their macro is pretty good, and then when Kellen is out, their macro is horrific. Remember, the narrative surrounding DK at Worlds last year is that they are very talented with no macro. That was not the case for a majority of the year. When Kellen was playing for them, their macro was fine. It was average. It was pretty decent, actually, all things considered. And that was kind of the case in 2023 when he got benched towards the back half of the year for Bible as well. And so it just feels like he's been given a bad rep. I understand he's not the most efficient player in the world. LS heads will, scream at him for buying control wards in the same way that they'll scream at Beryl, but I think generally his mechanics are a bit underrated, and I think he's a lot closer to being Beryl than people give him credit. I've basically given them identical grades over the course of the last 2 years. I think they're very similar players in terms of what they've done. Kellen's honestly been more consistent than Beryl. He just hasn't had the same kind of highs, and so, for me, I think this is a good pickup. If you're, gonna go with a very young AD carry, which you obviously are here, or at the very least an inexperienced AD carry, I think someone like Kellen, who's got a really good head on his shoulders in terms of the macro game, can kind of guide him into that position and try to get the best out of him early on. I just don't really know if this team outside of him has the mechanics to be able to take advantage of his good shot calling, which has always been his biggest weakness, is his mechanics. But you are bringing in Vikla into the mid lane. A very interesting year last year. It's been a very interesting 2 years, I would say, overall for Vikla. Obviously, goes to North America in 2023, and is fine. Like, I think he was better than people are going to give him credit for in retrospect because that FlyQuest team was a disaster, but by the time he got benched towards the end of the spring split, or the end of the summer split, he deserved it, right? Like, his play had gotten worse and worse and worse, and even though I don't think it was nearly as bad as people say it was, he was, in my opinion, the best mid laner in North America in the spring split of that year. He definitely was someone that, even an NA team would want to move on from, and then he goes over to the LPL, gets a shot on Rare Atom, looks incredibly good at the pre-tournament Demacia Cup, and then just doesn't do anything the entire year. Is awful in spring, is a little bit better in summer, but overall Rare Atom was a bit disappointing and just generally didn't live up to expectations even when he had a really good jungler in the second half in Zhao Hao, and now he's coming back to the LCK where he won Rookie of the Year in 2022, which a lot of people are going to forget, and I just don't know what to expect from him. C+ feels kind of generous with how he has played in recent years. There is a world in which he comes in and is just like the worst mid laner in the LCK, but I could also see him being relatively fine, pretty stable. Closer isn't exactly a player that I rate like incredibly highly. I don't think it's a clear-cut downgrade in that sense, where I think like Vicla's mechanics are better than Closer's, and I think that, in the best case scenario, Vicla comes in and it is what Closer is, but his consistency is just so much worse, and so it's hard for me to call this anything other than a change. Same thing for the support position, by the way. I want to almost consider that a downgrade because I expect Duro to be like a B+, A- this year, but, we haven't seen that yet, so I don't want to consider Kellen a downgrade to that just yet. Kellen has been perfectly fine as a starting support at this level, but that really brings in the question here. Diablo in the AD carry role. This is definitely going to be the most interesting part of this team because I think he is actually going to make or break whether or not this is like one of the weaker teams in the LCK. A lot of responsibility is going to be placed on him basically from day one. This is an internal promotion. He was playing for their Challengers League team last year, and, honestly, going and watching the tape, I'm not sold on this. I think he is the weakest of the LCK Challengers League promotions across basically the entire league this year. I really didn't see a player that I expect to make that transition to the LCK easily, and especially because we've seen better prospects like the DRX teams or the Nongshim teams come up and not perform well, even with, more comfortable surrounding cores. Like, Diablo is not one of the players I would expect to buck that trend in the AD carry role. That being said, clearly this organization has some faith and trust in him. This was a decision they made very early on in the offseason. There were other options available, and they chose to go with Diablo anyways, and so, we'll see. I don't see it in the tape. I think of all of the AD carries in the entire league, he is certainly the one that I am the least confident in, and we'll talk about another promoted AD carry a bit later in this video, but I certainly don't feel nearly as good about Diablo as I do about that other AD carry. And so for now, he's going to get a C grade. This is the lowest I'll give a prospect. I don't really see the promotion material in the Challengers League tape. Hopefully I'm wrong on that. Perhaps he can come in and actually be pretty good. Again, I think it's a pretty good situation for him, all things considered. Raptor is a jungler that's going to take a lot of the, big attention and resources away. Vicla's pretty aggressive as well, and Kellen is a really nice, mental, voice to have in call and comms to be able to get you through a lot of those rough early parts of your career that I think some players struggle with. And I think, throwing an inexperienced player into a team with a ton of veterans like this one has is generally a more proven way to have those young players develop better, but it's just really hard for me to imagine Diablo's going to be, phenomenal in year one, which is why he comes in graded so low. So overall, I'm going to be honest, this is probably the weakest offseason in the LCK, and even then, they pretty much side graded at most positions. I think bringing in Kellen is totally fine. You retained Raptor, and, I know people like Clear, and so that's generally fine. Vicla's a punt, though. Again, Kellen's even a buy low punt, and Diablo is very much like an unknown for me, and so all of those things considered, with basically everybody else in the league kind of getting better, I would have to argue that this is one of the off-seasons that kind of impressed me the least. But then going from one team that I think had a pretty tame offseason, all things considered, to a team with a very flashy offseason, it's the Kwangdong Freecs, and they certainly made their moves. They brought in a lot of the big kind of middle players in terms of the free agent market this offseason, and they continue to try and build something interesting here. I really liked their offseason last year. I thought, bringing Cousin was a really big deal, and Dudu is obviously a player I've really gone to bat for in the past. Bulldog is a player that I think has developed really well and has turned into a pretty good mid laner at this level. It was really just the bot lane that they needed to figure out. They threw a couple of things at the wall. Obviously, Taiyun didn't work out at the start of the year, so they go to Bull. Bull's good for like 2 weeks, and then he's bad. They go to Leaper. He's good for 2 weeks, and he's bad. Even Ondol or whoever was playing in the support position. Quantum last year, they were fine. They weren't generally phenomenal, but they were playable. But Feels like they finally started to solidify on a 5-man roster that's just good across the board. Maybe they're not great in any specific area. They don't have a superstar. Maybe they don't in any specific area. We'll talk about that. I think they could. But they're really consistent across the board, and I really like the fact that they brought in a lot of these like mid-range free agents. These are the kinds of teams that grade out typically really well in my rankings. But let's go ahead and go over it. Their lineup is looking like Dudu in the top lane, Pioshik in the jungle, Bulldog in the mid lane, Berserker at AD carry, and Life at support. Of course, the solo laner sticking around. Dudu has kind of become the star, quote-unquote, of this team. This guy's incredibly good. He had a little bit of a rough year last year because he wasn't receiving nearly as many resources as he had in previous years. The bot lane was actually getting a lot of the resources here for KDF. They were trying to play for Bull and Leaper because they wanted them to feel comfortable in those roles, and also it was more of a bot lane-focused meta. And generally, that was just bad for the team overall. Leaper ended up falling off in terms of the performances he was able to give, and Dudu really struggled playing more weak side. I don't think that's going to be as much of a problem here. You have so many winning lanes, and I think bot lane generally is going to be so much stronger in the early game that I think you can play for topside more. Pioshik has shown a propensity to play for topside in certain roles and in certain seasons, and so I'm really excited to see if Dudu can get back onto that march for being like a clear, consistent top 3 top laner, because he was right up there with the big 3 in like 2023, so I was really disappointed to see him just kind of be a guy in 2024. I still think he can get back to that, but for now, obviously, I think it's a good idea to keep him. He can still be one of the, I guess, better top laners, just maybe more inconsistently. And then Bulldog has been a guy that you've invested a lot in. He was the youngest player in the league when you brought him in, and he's really developed well. I would say he's much more developed as a facilitator than he has as a carry, which I think is both good and bad. He came into the league with ridiculous mechanics, but he really struggled to be able to stay consistent in terms of playing for the team. I feel like he's kind of overcorrected in the other direction, though, at this point, because it really does feel like he is a little adverse to actually trying to gain resources himself and to try to carry games on his own. He's certainly talented enough. We've seen the mechanical difference he can have, even against the good mid laners in the region, you know, the top 5. He's very firmly settled into that number 6 spot for me, spoiler alert, I guess, for the player rankings, but I feel like he's definitely better than everybody in the bottom 4, but definitely worse than all of the players in the top 5. That's a pretty good place to be, though, and I think he could continue to grow. If he was more of a B caliber player, an inconsistently great player with some really big pop-off moments throughout this year, I'm not going to be hugely surprised. Again, it's a good idea to bring him back. There was a lot of talk and rumors that this was going to be someone like Closer. Bulldog is better than Closer, at least in my opinion at the current moment, and so I certainly feel good about them keeping the solo laners, but everybody else, very, very intriguing. The only downgrade I have here is going to be going from Cuz to Pioshik for very similar reasons to what I talked about in the KT Rolster section, as they basically just swapped teams. They actually did just swap teams. I think Cuz is just a better player. Pioshik is way more inconsistent in terms of what he offers. The good side of this for KDF is that Pioshik's best games are better than Cuz's best games. They're just way more inconsistent, and you're going to have to live with the really bad games or weeks or months that he's going to give you at times throughout the year. And so, you know, I'm not like freaking out that you lost Cuz and, you know, got Pioshik. I do think you would have been better off if this was just running it back with Cuz, but at least for now, Pioshik is a pretty good, I guess, secondary option for this team. And if they weren't going to be able to retain Cuz, if he was always going to be going to a team like KT Rolster, if you needed somebody to step in and fill that void for being like a top 4 or top 5 jungle, Pioshik is probably the best option you had available. But it's the bot lane that really gives me a lot of confidence that this team is going to be better. Like I said, the bot lane was the weakness for this team for all of last year and for all of 2023. That really kind of kept them out of contention in those years, and now you're bringing in Berserker and Life, 2 players who are coming off of very opposite trajectories. Berserker obviously completely broke out when he first came over to North America playing for Cloud9. This looked like a fantastic signing. He was the best player in the region, an MVP winner over in North America, and then this past year had some ups and downs. I honestly don't think that he played particularly well. I certainly don't think he was consistent at all, but there are still flashes, and generally Cloud9 was just a mess last year for a lot of different reasons. It's hard to really blame Berserker, but if you would have asked me before 2024, like, oh, Berserker's going back to the LCK, how do you think he will do? I would have said, like, this guy could win for a top 3 team right now. Like, he could be a player that's on a world's winning team. That's what I would have said at the end of 2023. Obviously, it's a little bit different now, but B is just about the lowest I could possibly go on Berserker's upside. His mechanics are genuinely insane, and I think a lot of teams were really trying to get him this offseason, and I think KDF won the lottery. I'm not sure if other Western teams were looking. You know, I'm not sure what the deal was, but overall, it's fantastic that he's able to go back to the LCK and really get his first shot here at the Tier 1 League. Remember, he was plucked out of the the Challengers League first and foremost and actually get a shot to play against other LCK teams regularly, I think we could be seeing a big breakout for Berserker. And that's why I said this team doesn't have a star on paper, but man, if Berserker trims into like a B+, A- throughout this year, I'm not going to be surprised at all. The guy is certainly good enough to be able to do that. I think people just forget that because he's coming from North America. And then Life is certainly not a bad support. Had a really nice bounce back in 2024. I thought he was excellent for Fun Plus Phoenix. He was right up there for me for most important player on that team, right next to Milky Way. I think he got lost in the shuffle a lot because Milky Way's breakout was just so like eye-catching for a lot of people, but he really kind of changed the support meta in the LPL for quite a while. His Rumble support was genuinely unstoppable for a lot of last year, and even when he was off of that, when he was on these more aggressive supports that can trade and dominate lane, he still looked really good. He's obviously been a player that's had a really good career, really good track record in the past. He had a really awful 2023, which is why he was in the LPL in the first place, because that Hanwha Life year was just a disaster for him, but he has been good basically every year except 2023, and so I'm willing to say that that was a bit of an outlier, maybe just a bad fit or a bad year or a bad circumstance, something, right? And I'm willing to kind of guess and bet that he's going to be better moving into 2025, or at least what he was in 2024, which is about a B-level player, a good mid-tier support. So when you look across the board, obviously both of those bot lanes are an upgrade. You know, jungle, I call a downgrade because I do think it is worse, but I don't think it's worse by a lot. I think it's like a very slight downgrade, and you're hoping for development out of the mid lane, and you know, you're hoping for Dudu to get back to his like really top level form. This could be a team that competes for top 4. I don't think that that's like super likely because teams in the LCK are just really good, and if you don't have one of those X factor players, if you don't have a B+ at the bare minimum to kind of carry your team in a lot of circumstances, it's really difficult to be able to compete. But this team doesn't really have a weak link on paper, and I think I really like that kind of construction. Hopefully this flashy offseason can end up working out for them. But then moving on to our 8th team in this video, and this is certainly a fun roster, if not one that I think will be particularly good. It's Nongshim RedForce. It's a really weird offseason for this team because they really went out and spent what I assume is a decent amount of money to bring in a couple of really high-profile, really successful players in top lane and in support, but they kept the same everywhere else, and this was already a team that wasn't particularly good, and so it ends up feeling like a very strange roster configuration that I really don't know how it's going to work. I don't know if it's going to be good, if it's going to be bad, if it's going to be awful. It could be any of those things, and generally I would believe it, but let's get into the specifics as we continue to go. Their lineup is looking like Kingen in the top lane, Sylvie in the jungle, Fisher in the mid lane, Jiwoo at AD carry, and Lahens at support. The analogy that I want to use about Nongshim is one that I really like, and it's they ordered a $1 steak that, you know, the restaurant found on the side of the road, and then they have the most gourmet French fries you have ever had in your entire life as the side. You have completely neglected the core of this team, and it's really not worked out. You've brought in piece after piece, and you've tried to promote from within to create something that has been successful, and it's really just not worked out at all. For Nongshim, they've not really been anything other than bad, quite frankly, over the past couple of years, and to add on to that core, you've said, okay, we've got our core settled. It's going to be Sylvie, Fisher, and Jiwoo, and we're going to bring in Kingen and Lahens, and now they're going to be the players to take us over the top. But at the end of the day, like, I don't know if the core of this team is good enough to be able to land there. Sylvie and Fisher in particular are just not really that good, or at least they have not performed all that well. Sylvie, I certainly think, has been better. He was better in 2024 than he was in 2023, where he was a disaster. He performed very similar to Sponge in 2024 back 2 years ago, but he did start to get a bit more comfortable. There were times that I had him kind of bordering on a C+ in terms of the grade that I was giving him, because I think it's reasonable to see some of the flashes last year and to say I can work with that and we can move forward with that. And Sylvie was a player I really liked a lot when he was in the Challengers League. It's not like he's coming from nothing and is finally starting to figure something out. It's more so using him as kind of a piece that you need to rely on in order to win games. I know Pioshik was kind of rumored here for a while. You know, there were other jungle options, but Sylvie is just not the one that I personally would have wanted to see here. And Fisher is even more concerning, in my opinion. While he was okay in like the final 2 weeks of the regular season in summer, I just can't forget what he was in the LPL last year in the spring split. For people who don't watch the LPL, maybe they only watch the LCK, Fisher was in the LPL for a long time. He was in the development system for Edward Gaming, finally got his opportunity last year to play after Scout left, and was awful. Like, the single worst player in the LPL levels of awful. Like, he was actively losing games super regularly, and he was a C-, a D+ type of player, like, genuinely, in terms of the performance he offered. Came over here to the LCK and was pretty bad at the start. Maybe not quite as bad as he was on Edward Gaming, but still not great. And then things started to feel a little bit better when he was playing mid laners that weren't quite as good towards the end of the summer split. That's why he gets a C grade. Anything else and he would be a C- at like the absolute maximum, because that's kind of all we've seen from him. This guy is just yet to have been good really at any point for more than a week or two in his entire career. And he wasn't even really all that good in the LDL when he was given opportunities there. And so I don't believe in Fisher. I think this is a big mistake. And I'll just say this now, like, this is the worst jungle mid, at least on paper, in the entire region. And it's not close. And that's a problem for a team in Nongshim, because the game is very focused on the middle of the map right now, and I imagine that will get even worse with the new map, and so, we'll see how that goes. The one that I'm more than happy that you are retaining here of the players that are coming back is Jiwoo. Obviously, he is the best player on this team. He was easily the best player on this team last year. I think sometimes he gets a bit more hyped up then I would personally hype him up, because the rest of his team has been so bad and he has carried a lot of really bad situations, but like, he's still incredibly talented. I would consider him someone who's like at the bare minimum a B-, somebody who is a lot closer to being a B. I put him in the same category as a player like Bulldog that we talked about with Kwangdong, where it's like at any point I think he could break through and like really cement himself as towards the upper part of the middle of the rankings. Like, it's hard to break through to the top because you're, competing with the best players in the world. But Jiwoo could be somebody that is good enough to play for a KT Rolster or a Dplus KIA or something like that. I firmly believe that that is a totally fine upside for him, and I'm totally fine with you keeping him here. And I think pairing him with Lehens, this could be a very, very dangerous bot lane. That's the upside. That's the expected upside, I guess, of this team. But jungle mid is just so scary, even if Jiwoo is a very good retention here. But as we talked about, we've got your gourmet french fries on the side. You've got your fantastic side dish to complement your paltry main dish at this point, is the best way I can put it. And that's bringing Lehens in the support position. I can't imagine that he was, like, not sought after by a lot of different teams. He must have chosen this destination. Maybe he didn't. Maybe he didn't actually have a ton of suitors in the offseason. I would be stunned if that was the case, but I'm still going to give him an A grade. This is obviously an upgrade. I liked Vital, and I thought he was actually playing pretty well down the stretch, and I'm interested to see how he develops playing more support as somebody who role swapped from AD carry, but Lehens is arguably the best support in the world. He certainly performed like it last year, and for Nongshim to be able to pick him up, like, that's astounding. The fact that Lehens is going to be playing this year with Fisher and Sylvie as his mid-jungle duo is hilarious, and if they start to perform well, I'm not saying it's all going to be Lehens, but this is a guy who has performed well everywhere he stopped, especially in the last 3 years. I wasn't the biggest fan of his when he was on, like, middle-tier teams, when he was on Afrika and, that era, the post-Griffin era, but the moment he went to Gen.G and really solidified himself as one of the top supports, he maintained that. He was excellent on KT Rolster in 2023, and then went back to Gen.G and continued to be one of the best supports in the world. There's no reason for me to rank him below an A. I genuinely think he's on the same level as, like, a Keria, and above a level like Delight. It's kind of what we've seen. I just don't think the production's going to be there. He's a very aggressive player, and I don't know if the team is going to be able to back him up in a lot of those instances. So while this is a fantastic addition, typically I would say you need some sort of supporting cast, and I just don't know if you have that here. But again, Jiwoo and Lehens could be a very scary 2v2 in the bot lane if things end up going really right for them. But then you've also got Kingin in the top lane. He is the other big addition here. Kingin's fine. He's a really good player and somebody that is very serviceable if you're trying to make worlds, and I think that's a good addition for Nongshim. But if he's the second best player on your team, that's usually not a good sign. He's just not the kind of player that you want to be giving a ton of resources to. He can win, especially in the late game. He's a pretty decent team fighter, but he's really not someone that is consistent at all, and he's not better than the best top laners in the region. So if you're relying on him to be able to win you games, you're just never really going to have the upside of ever being able to beat those teams unless something goes incredibly wrong, right? This is still an upgrade because top lane was a disaster for this team all of last year, whether it was Din, whether it was Mihail. Both of them were really bad. Both of them were some of the worst top laners in the entire league for this team. Kingin is definitely going to be a stabilizing presence on that side, and it's going to allow, Sylvie and Fisher to potentially be a little bit more proactive in the early game because they don't have to rely so much on trying to protect the top side of the map. But I don't think he's the guy that should come in and be the second best player. Lehens is fine being the best player on the team, but man, there's a lot of pressure on players that have never really performed or never really had to perform at a playoff level. Sylvie, Fisher, and Jiwoo have to be playoff caliber players this year for this team to win, because the three most important positions in pro right now are taken up by players that have never made the playoffs, and you've got all pro caliber players around him. So it's a super intriguing offseason. I really hate this strategy as much as I praised the Kwangdong Freecs for like their offseason, which is get a bunch of good players and just try to make a team that's really well-rounded and doesn't have a ton of weaknesses. I really hate the strategy of spend all your money on one or two players and then compromise everywhere else. I think that has proven to be significantly less successful. But if Lehens is as good as I think he is, and if Kingen can stabilize on the top side, perhaps you get a better year out of Sylvie and Fisher. And I like Jiwoo. I think he can very easily be a top 4, top 5 AD carry in the region right now. This team could be a playoff team. I just find it a little hard to believe that they're ever going to reach the expectations that maybe you would expect for players like King and Lehens. And then moving on to number 9, we're getting towards the back half here. Teams that very much had a lot to change in order to find themselves competitive. And this team did, once again, even if, again, I'm not the biggest fan in the world, it's DRX. I still think that they are struggling to find a cohesive identity, and I continue to really disagree with some of the decisions that this organization is making. I liked their offseason last year because, bringing up young players is almost always a good thing. They just didn't end up working out. The players weren't good enough, but I'm really, really critical of this team for not sticking with the ones that did actually land and moving in directions that I just think are passive and very sideways, and we'll talk about it. But their lineup is looking like Rich in the top lane, Juhan in the jungle, Yukal in the mid lane, Teddy at AD carry, and Ondil at support. Teddy is obviously the one member that is remaining here. This is fine. I think, again, Teddy's going to do better this year than he did last year. I was very critical of Teddy's game last year. He gets glazed harder than any player in the entire universe online. And, part of it I think I can understand. He is obviously a very veteran player, somebody who's kind of historic in the LCK because he was on those Jin Air teams for so long that weren't good. He was a T1 AD carry, which obviously brings with it its own set of, interesting narratives and its own set of fans and haters and all of that. But generally, Teddy has kind of been the same player throughout his entire career, which is a very slow, very passive, very, mechanically talented, but not exactly aggressive player. He's just not that. That's not who he will ever be. And that's why I think he really struggled when he was the number 1 option on this team last year. And it's why he struggled on Sandbox the year before when he was the number 1 option on that team, in my opinion. He would sit there and he would have really good score lines. He would be, 4-0 and 8 when the team lost. And his damage would be low, like way too low, considering, what the game overall was. And people would say, oh, he's hard stuck. He's not throwing the game away. You're right. Teddy's not throwing the game away, but he's not winning the game either. And I think adding players onto this team that can take more of a primary carry role, that can be more of kind of the resource getters, and allowing Teddy to be what he has always been best at, which is this supreme weak side AD carry that's really good in team fights, even with low resources. I think that's really going to hopefully get a better version of him back out, because last year we just didn't really see that, in my opinion. He was just way too slow, even if, in my opinion, he started playing better over the back half of the year when he actually started dying more, when he started taking a lot more trades. I thought that helped the team a lot more. So I think that's going to be a good thing, but a negative that maybe swings it in the other direction for me is that you're losing Playta. You're not losing him, you're demoting Playta, and you've signed Ondil. There is no explanation for this. This, to me, is maybe the worst move of the offseason in the entire LCK. This is completely unjustifiable from basically every perspective, and I don't even hate Ondil. I think he has shown flashes of being a good LCK support. He's not found any sort of consistency on KDF, and, I think it is a punt to kind of bring him in and see if you can turn that around. It's a very a BRION-esque move, if you will, to bring in players that have kind of not worked out elsewhere and see if you can revitalize them. But Playta's incredible. He was the best player on this team last year, in my opinion, and did so much for them to be able to push them over the top. Obviously, I'm a huge fan of his game, and I've said for a long time, I think he genuinely can be a top, 3 support in the world if everything were to develop for him. He's just been, super hyper productive everywhere he has played, including his first year back in the LCK last year. And to bench him for Ondil, who has shown significantly less at the LCK level, I just think is completely unjustifiable. Playta should be starting here, and I think he will be after long. Like, he's still here. He's playing for DRX Challengers right now, which is, again, absurd. He is way too good to be down in the Challengers League, very reminiscent of Willer last year, but you know, like, I don't want to sit here and just completely criticize Ondo. I think he does a couple of things right. He's very aggressive. That can lead him into some situations where, you know, the negative plays outshine the good plays, which is what kind of happened on KDF because he wasn't playing with a particularly good AD carry during his tenure there. But Teddy should hopefully bring a bit of stability, and I could see this bot lane potentially being fine. I just think the bot lane of Teddy and Plata was already starting to develop more chemistry, and Plata is somebody that I really want to see DRX move forward with as kind of their core player in the support position. And to bench him, it just feels very strange. Like, and the fact that nobody else picked him up, the fact that no other team called and was like, hey, can we have Plata? We would really like to bring him in, and we would really like to play him. Maybe DRX didn't want to sell, but then why aren't you starting him? Like, it just feels so strange to me. So, you know, Ondo, hopefully he's fine, but honestly, I would be shocked if before long Ondo wasn't benched and Plata wasn't back in, because I do believe he is just the better player with more upside. But everything else I think is fine. These are sort of the lateral moves I was talking about. UCal is not a lateral move. Bringing in UCal is a huge upgrade, and this is the biggest upgrade they made. That's why I said Teddy might be in a better spot this year, because bringing UCal in gives this team a primary option that they can play through. He has been exceptionally good for Thunder Talk over in the LPL, a team that has really struggled to find any semblance of consistency. There have been times where UCal has played like a top 5 mid laner in the world for an entire split. Like, he has truly been unbelievable, completely revitalized his career over in the LPL, in my opinion, and coming back here to the LCK, I think he's ready to be the primary option on a team like this. I think he's good enough for you to be able to play through and make the playoffs in the LCK if you have the right surrounding core. The question is whether or not they have the right surrounding core. I liked Yehu at least a little bit. He wasn't consistent at all, but I don't think he was the worst piece of this DRX team. See the topside grades, but UCal is definitely an upgrade. He is genuinely somebody that's going to be like pushing to be in that conversation for the upper tier of mid laners. We talked about, you know, players like BDD and Showmaker. If UCal performs basically to the level of those players, I'm really not going to be all that surprised. I just kind of need to see it before I give him a B+ instead of the B. But then you get to the top side. These are technically upgrades because what you are coming from was just so terrifically bad. Juhan's coming back here to DRX in the jungle. He's finally actually getting a starting spot on this team. It looks like he'll be starting over Sponge. Of course, that is the correct option. Juhan is way more stable and way more consistent. Sponge was probably the single worst player in the LCK last year. The consistency was not there, and he was just getting abused basically for the entirety of the year. Didn't really play well at any stretch. And while Juhan's not a spectacular player, he's been fine for Giant X over in the LEC. Very stable, very much a Maokai Sejuani player. They know what they're getting into when they sign him. He's not going to be this big game breaker, but if you have players like UCal and Rich in terms of your solo lanes, like, they're very aggressive in terms of how they want to play out a lot of these games. Having someone like Juhan that's very good at slowing the pace of the game down and making sure that mistakes don't happen nearly as consistently could be a pretty massive positive for them. And then, you know, Rich is going to be their new top laner. He has been all around the block. He's finally back in the LCK after taking trips to the LPL and to the LCS over in North America. He's back in the LCK now, and I'm not the biggest fan of Rich in the world outside of North America. I think he worked so well in NA because that style of game is so prevalent, where Rich is the most specialized top laner you're going to find. He's horrible in lane, like truly horrific in the 1v1s. He gets abused super regularly, but he is like genuinely a phenomenal team fighter. It's very, very interesting to watch. You can tell he comes from a different game, Heroes of the Storm, and, you know, you can tell he's not quite as used to champion matchups and to laning, and it's never going to be something that he has a huge strength in, but he is so good at team fighting that you can kind of survive that, and so you're already kind of moving into a more passive style on the top side. I think Juhan very much solidifies that, but no matter what you had in the top lane role, you were upgrading here. Rascal is the lowest graded player that I've had in terms of his individual game performances in a long time. I know I said Sponge was probably the worst player in the LCK. That's only because Rascal didn't play for a majority of this split. If Rascal played the whole split, he would have easily been the worst player in the LCK. He has been unplayable for 2 straight years now. He was awful in 2023. He was awful in 2024. This team needed to move on from him, and Frog wasn't exactly the replacement they were looking for. I think Rich is fine, if not, you know, a little bit boring. I'm really not into Rich. It's just going to be better, right? But that being said, like, Rich, a bit boring as a player, somebody that is going to be not very active in the early game. Juhan, a bit passive and boring as a player, not going to be super active in the early game. Teddy, a bit passive as a player, not going to be super active in the early game. I'm a little bit worried about the play styles here on DRX, that they're just not very complementary, and I already don't think you're, like, overloaded with talent mechanically, and so I could see this team being pretty bad over the course of next year, and especially if Playta's not in the lineup at some point, but I can basically guarantee that they are going to be better, if not just because UCal, I think, is too good to be a player that gets completely run over in the mid lane, and we've already seen what he can do to drag a Thunder Talk gaming team to relevance over in the LPL. I think it could be a similar story here for DRX, but I guess it's a wait-and-see approach. But that brings us to our final team of the video, and for the first time in this channel's history, I can talk about this team's offseason and not completely rag on them. It's okay, BRION. They are, of course, the 10th team from last year. They were the worst team overall in the LCK. Who could have seen that coming after someone lambasted their offseason once again? I went especially hard on Bro in this video last year, talking about how absurd it was that they claimed their big offseason additions to be Envy coming into the bot lane, or, you know, picking up, at the time, Gideon in the jungle, where it's like, you have to compete with teams that are putting out, like, pretty decent, you know, players in 5th, 6th, if you want to make playoffs, if you want to be relevant at all. For this team to invest basically in none of those players, to pick up a lot of players who had basically shown that they were not LCK playoff caliber, it just felt ridiculous, and it felt like the culmination of what this organization had been doing for years, which is cutting costs at the expense of being competitive, really, under any circumstance. The only times they've been able to win have been accidental, winning with some of the lowest budget rosters in the entire league, but finally, we get to enter one of these videos for the first time ever, and I don't get to slam BRION. I actually get to compliment them on what I consider to be a pretty positive offseason. Now, not everything here is perfect, and I think there are ways for this to go wrong, but if Kespa Cup is to be believed, this team isn't really all that bad anymore, and their pickups are actually pretty successful. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Their lineup is looking like Morgan in the top lane, Hambach in the jungle, Closer in the mid lane, Hype at AD carry, and Polu at support. It does look like it's going to be Hype. They announced both Hype and Bull coming in the AD carry roles. Hype is significantly better, and he will get a higher grade from me, but it was up for debate, I guess, which one would be starting from day one. I'm glad it's Hype. But overall, for BRION, this is a pretty good team. You keep your best player from last year in Morgan on the top side of the map. Lord Morgan continues to be the ultimate bro for this team. I do think that at times he gets a little bit more because of his fan base than maybe he deserves, but he's still a really good player. I mean, I have the same grade on him as I had on, like, Kingen and Dudu, and a lot of these players that I would consider, like, borderline all-pro caliber. Morgan is borderline all-pro caliber. I believe he was an all-pro for me in the spring split of last year, and so I believe in him. I don't think he was quite as good in summer. I think Bro in general just had a lot going on in the summer split, but Morgan is still a good player to be able to keep. Top lane is a very competitive role at the LCK level, and Morgan is more than good enough to hold his own in that conversation. If you're going to keep one player, it's obviously going to be him, but they didn't just keep one player. They kept 2 overall, and the other one I'm not quite as enthused by. Polu is going to be returning here as the starting support. I am very low on what his 2024 looked like. I thought he was, quite frankly, really bad in the summer split. One of the weaker supports that I analyzed, especially with players like Duro and Plata as, like, young Challengers League supports coming in and performing really well. It was frustrating to see Polu, like, be as bad as he was on this team, but there are some reasons to believe that maybe that's not entirely the story. First of all, he had to play with Envy the entire year, and Envy is just not a very good player. I'm pretty out on him. I thought he was generally whatever, but, you know, Polu wasn't exactly playing with the best bot lane partner in the entire universe, which is certainly something to consider, but man, his individual plays were really bad. He was constantly dying. Playing engaged supports and being disconnected from the rest of your team is a huge problem, and it never really felt like it was getting better for him as the year went on, and so we'll see if that ends up being, like, a continuous issue for him and a continuous issue for BRION in general, but he's certainly the player with the most to prove, in my opinion, out of everybody on this team, and that's including 2 players who have never played at least an extended stretch at the LCK level, being the promotions here from KT Challengers. I'm skipping right to them, Hambach and Hype. Of course, we talked about it earlier. LCK Challengers was basically run by KT Rolster last year. They basically completed the Golden Road, and so a lot of their players were always going to get pretty heavy consideration for the LCK. It's nice to see 2 of them end up on the same team, and I think this is a fantastic punt from BRION. This is something that I've really complimented teams like DRX and BRION, or not BRION, and Nongshim in the past for doing, which is finding players that you think might be able to translate into some upside and at least giving them a chance. Now, they don't always work, and we've seen BRION, like, theoretically do the same thing with players like Polu, or even someone like Karis or Youngjae last year, who I think is fine, but, like, these are genuinely very good prospects coming up. These are prospects that I think would have gotten offers from better teams in the mid part of the year, you know, if they're struggling in other positions. I don't think think they would have been easy commodities to get elsewhere in the year, and so I think BRION's going to be very happy to be able to acquire them. Hype is the one I'm a little bit less sure of. I still think he's going to be good. I originally had this as a C+, because while I do think he is a good player, I think he was benefited a lot by playing with a lot of really good players on KT Challengers. That being said, his mechanics are still really good. I just worry that the bot lane might not be as good as anticipated. It was really good in Kespa Cup, which is certainly something to consider. I'm not taking that super into account because I don't know how seriously a lot of those teams took that tournament. You know, it's been a very short amount of time since they all started working together. Communication is likely not there for a lot of the other teams at the tournament, and so Bro's success isn't necessarily something that I'm expecting to translate as like a top 4 team, but hype was really good there, and I think hopefully the hype around him can, you know, be something that they can live up to. But Hanwha is really the one that I'm really excited to see. He was excellent for KT Challengers. They had the best jungle mid in the Challengers League by far with him and Zinni, and I really believe he could be a game changer. I like Gen.G. I think he's a pretty solid, you know, jungle prospect. I think he was trapped a little bit here on the BRION team that just never was going to be good enough for him to be able to actually like develop. But Hanwha is like a special kind of prospect. I honestly considered giving him the B tag. I give him B- because I don't think he's quite like a surefire thing in the same way that I typically associate with like B-graded players who have never played in the LCK or at least have not received extended stretches in the LCK, but he is pretty darn close. He is probably the best prospect not named, I guess, Berserker if you count him, coming up and playing in the LCK for the first time. I think he really is exceptional, and I'm really excited to see if he can change the fortunes of BRION, because you're bringing in Closer in the mid lane as well. Now, I'm not the biggest Closer fan in the world. Anybody who's followed the channel will know that. I'm pretty low on him in comparison to a lot of the other players in his archetype. I've actually historically been very high on players that play like Closer. When you think of a lot of channel darlings, you think of players like Zeka, you think of Cream, you even think of someone like Strive or Certus over in the LEC, or Palafox in the LCS. Like, you think a lot of these players who are very good at these melee, you know, carry champions, and Closer very much fits that role. He's a lot more comfortable playing super aggressive and playing for those melee aggressive matchups, things like Yone in the early game, but he just doesn't have the same kind of it factor. I think he's really benefited a lot over the course of his career from playing with some really talented players and generally just kind of coasting off of the T1 reputation he earned a long time ago. I think he's been fine for FearX and for Sandbox. I think he's been overrated at times for that team, like when they were successful in 2022 and he was an all-pro. Absolutely absurd that he was an all-pro that split. He was not even remotely close, in my opinion, to being on that list, but he's really kind of stabilized as being a competent mid laner at this level, which I think is more than good enough for you to be able to win with, and especially if you're pairing him up with someone like Hanwha, who maybe just needs a veteran presence that can survive in lane to be able to kind of push forward, and you've got Morgan on the top side. Like, hopefully this is a stabilizing presence. Now, that being said, Closer is not a stable player. That's not how he plays the game. He's very aggressive, as I said earlier, and so you could be running into situations where he's taking too much of the spotlight away from players like Hanwha and Hype, and that would really not be ideal for me. And so, while I think Closer is fine to bring in here, I think he's about as good as Fate, and honestly, playstyle-wise, I probably would have preferred Fate, but that's just personal opinion. Closer coming in is certainly not a downgrade by any means. He's a fine player. Just I don't like him personally. I don't like his tape as much as a lot of other analysts do, but bringing in those Challengers League players I think is absolutely ginormous. Hanwha and Hype coming in here I think completely changed the trajectory and the outlook of this team overall, and keeping Morgan here I think is a really big positive. This is easily the best offseason that BRION has ever had since entering the LCK. I don't even think that's really all that up for debate. I've never felt excitement like this around this team before, and you know, we'll see. They obviously performed really well in a preseason tournament. That's not always been a very good indicator as to what teams are going to be good moving forward, but you know, there's a lot of upside here, and if they end up being a team that sneakily competes for top 6, I think that's very much in the cards for them. But that is going to do it for my LCK 2025 offseason roster overview, analysis, grades, whatever video. We've gone through all 10 teams. We've gone through every single player. I've given a grade, an upgrade, a downgrade, a change. I've done everything. We've gone through the entirety of the LCK, and I do hope you guys enjoyed the video. Of course, we will be putting out more LCK content as we get closer and closer to the start of the actual LCK Cup, or the LCK Winter Split, or whatever they end up calling it at the end of the day. We'll get the titles correct by the time we get there, but thank you very much for watching. We'll have the LPL and LTA videos out very shortly. I'm gonna have to get very used to calling it the LTA, but they will be out next week. We've already got the LEC video out that you can check out, and you know, we're back rocking and rolling. If you can hear my voice kind of being shot a bit, it's because I'm getting back into the groove of recording these long 2-hour long videos, but I appreciate you guys' patience, and I do hope you enjoyed. But With all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all